And I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special webinar about building equitable partnerships in international research. And I think, MethodSpace readers come from all over the globe, because today we can simply cross boundaries with a click. But it's not so simple when we start to deal with complex research relationships. And that's particularly true when partners have uneven access to resources, funding, research assistance, and all of those support systems. So how can we move past those power differentials and collaborate fully in respectful ways? These are the kinds of questions we will be discussing here today. And I'm delighted to have this fantastic panel who are all members of the Research Ethics Journal editorial board. And you'll find the link to the journal, which is open access, in the chat area. So we have Dr. Doris Schroeder, who helped organize this panel from the University of Central Lancashire in the UK. Dr. Charles Ware from Western University in Canada. Dr. Cynthia Chingwe in the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and Dr. Sam Ujewe, who is ethics advisor to the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So our agenda today is going to be quite interactive, with about half of our session taken by a panel discussion with our panelists, and then the rest of the time for question and answer. We will continue to respond to questions that we don't have time to talk about here today on methodspace.com. So please, come to the site in the next couple of days, and we'll continue to discuss the issues that we're talking about here today. So again, please, post your questions in the chat or the Q&A area, or if you are on Twitter, you can post questions there. So I'm going to just stop our slides so we can highlight our panel here and begin with the first question. So can you give us an example of ethics dumping, which means unethical research undertaken in a lower income setting, which wouldn't have happened in a higher income setting? Charles, are you going to begin with an example here?
Thanks, Janet. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, good day, everyone who's joining us. I think many of you heard the announcement from the World Health Organization just 2 weeks ago, in which it recommended widespread use of a malaria vaccine called RTSS to prevent malaria in young children in Africa and beyond. The recommendation is based on the results of a pilot program conducted in Ghana, Kenya, and Malawi. So while this is really important news for the prevention of malaria, the pilot program upon which this recommendation is based is unfortunately a clear example of ethics dumping. The World Health Organization's malaria vaccine implementation program was designed as a cluster randomized trial to evaluate the real-world effectiveness, safety, and feasibility of the malaria vaccine. Starting in 2019, health districts in Ghana, Kenya, and Malawi were randomized to distribute either routine vaccinations only to children or routine vaccinations plus the malaria vaccine. And so far, over 800,000 children have been enrolled in the trial. Data was collected on effectiveness, safety, and feasibility of the vaccine. The World Health Organization insists that the pilot program is being carried out under the authority of the 3 governments involved. They say It is good practice, not medical or scientific experimentation. Well, this is despite the fact that safety concerns prompted the trial in the first place, including increased rates of meningitis, cerebral malaria, and a twofold increase in mortality in young girls. The full randomized controlled trial was not reviewed and approved by a research ethics committee. Only the plan for data collection was approved. And none of the parents were informed that their children are participants in a randomized controlled trial. This is wrong. In randomizing health districts to receive malaria vaccine or not, governments were not implementing the vaccine routinely. They were conducting research. And the use of a cluster randomized design just makes this plain. According to the authors of the CIOM's International Ethics Guidelines, and we'll include a link here to the paper in the chat, this is the official ethics guidelines for the World Health Organization. They conclude that the malaria vaccine implementation program must be reviewed as a whole by a research ethics committee, and the research-informed consent of parents on behalf of their children is required. This didn't happen, and that's why this is an instance of ethics dumping.
So Doris, what do you have to add?
I would like to give a different example, not a clinical example, but a social science example from personal experience, so that our viewers also realize that it doesn't have to be a clinical trial for ethics dumping to happen. So this example is from personal experience from myself, and we will have another example in the chat, which Chris will put in. The example is about avoiding getting ethics approval if you do social science research in a lower income setting. I've been working with an indigenous community in South Africa for the past 20 years, and they regularly ask me for advice. And just before the lockdown, one of the leaders asked me for advice again. She said we were approached by a European who would like to do a study, a social science study amongst us. And so we asked, as we always do, where is your European research ethics approval? And this person said, I don't have one. At my university, there is no facility to have an ethics approval for a social science study. It took me 10 seconds to find that this university, of course, has a research ethics committee that approves social science studies. So this researcher tried through the back door with a lie to get access to a vulnerable population in South Africa, hoping, presumably, that he will not be found out. So this is also a clear case, like Charles's, of ethics dumping, and Chris will put another similar case into the chat.
So my next question is, can you give an example of conduct in international research teams which you would like to change? And Cynthia is going to discuss this to begin with.
Thanks, Janet, for the question. I think two practices that I would like to see changes is the research agenda setting and in funding models. So in terms of research agenda setting, generally funders have predefined priorities when they send out funding calls. And this then tends to set the tone for many international research projects. Because of scarce funding in the Global South, then many Global South researchers then tend to literally chase this funding, irrespective of whether it is answering or it's responding to questions that are pertinent to their populations. And then we have the second case where, in response to funding calls, researchers in the Global North will approach their potential collaborators in the Global South with predefined research questions and sometimes a complete draft of a proposal. And the Global South researchers having very little opportunity to make input into the research questions. So we end up with a situation whereby, although there may be many funded international research projects ongoing in the Global South, inequities still persist because these research projects are not necessarily answering questions that are of pertinence to populations in the Global South. So I think the situation needs to be addressed, and there are two ways to go around it. One is for international, it's for funders to sort of broadly engage diverse stakeholder groups in the Global South when they're about to design internationally funded research projects or international research projects that will take place in the Global South. Another approach is during the evaluation process of funding applications. And I think that reviewers and funders should actively seek for evidence that the researchers in the Global North and in the Global South have actively co-created the research questions or the aims of the study that is before them. And I think lastly, I would love to see a change in the funding models. And there is no model that is 100% perfect. But I think the idea where you have a proportion of funding being allocated to the Global South, a very small proportion, meanwhile the research is taking place in the Global South. And so most times this proportion is so small that even with a well-experienced researcher, they can't achieve much with that funding. So I think funders should actively seek for equity-driven funding models.
Thank you. Sam, what would you like to add to this critical question?
Thank you very much. Just before I respond to the question, I'd just like to note that my response in this conversation are a product of expert opinion from my experience in global health research and not the position of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. In response to and following up to what Dr. Changwe has already mentioned, I would like to share the experience of African researchers in the global during the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, where researchers were relegated to data collectors and analysts. And here there are three examples I would like to just quickly run through. One involving researchers who were part of data collecting and initial analysis of samples, Ebola samples in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, who a few years post-epidemic wanted to have access to those samples that were stored in some high-income country outside of Africa, of course. And they were denied access. So apparently, in the process of the initial research or uptake of data and collecting of the samples, they were perhaps merely taken as data collectors rather than collaborators in this research, which they perceived themselves as. Whereas the researchers who came in from high income countries did not consider them as collaborators, but rather as perhaps just contractors who would just collect the data. And this was this did not fall in well with the researchers because they were seeing themselves rather as collaborators, and that was what motivated their attempt to access the data so that they could conduct locally initiated research a couple of years afterwards. And secondly, I just like to point quickly to one retrospective ethics approval that was sought by a researcher in Liberia during the Ebola epidemic still, who went ahead to conduct very sensitive research, collecting very sensitive data using local researchers too, against ethics without seeking ethics approval, where even though there was a process for expedited ethics approval. And only after the research was conducted and analysis already were done and research was ready to be published, that the researcher now went to the ethics committee and now put the local researchers in the front line to go and defend the ethics approval. And on the day of the review, the principal researcher, who was from the Global North, was not present, but the local researchers were, and they had to be in the receiving end. And retrospectively, if this research was approved and the product was going to come out, I doubt highly if the names of those local researchers who had to defend the reason why they had to do the research, I doubt if their names would have appeared as principal actors in that research, assuming it was approved. And then finally, in Guinea, there was also the case of research consortia who were supposed to be working on the same Ebola situation, trying to find ways of addressing the Ebola, became competitors, competing for local researchers, because usually the local researchers and scientists would be much fewer. So the consortia engage in competition rather than collaboration with local researchers. And what this engenders is a kind of a power dynamics where local researchers could begin to perceive themselves rather as contractors, or if you wish, not strictly in the terms, as properties of whichever research consortium happens to win them over. And then on the other side, you would find a case whereby the consortia may be also looking at the local researchers simply as contractors. And once the competition is over and data is collected and that initial phase of the research is done, then they would be perhaps not included in further down the research where academic publications happen and credit is given to who would have published research or who would have come up with a finding that is transformative.
You've given us a lot to think about. So the examples that that you've discussed so far, have to do with larger scale research projects. But thinking about a lot of our methods-based researchers who are doctoral students or early career researchers, how can they begin to build equitable research partnerships across countries? And Cynthia, can you discuss some ideas for that?
Sure. I think as early career researchers begin to launch their careers and establish collaborations, one thing that is important would be for them to reflect on their equity-oriented responsibilities. So what do they think personally will be their equity-oriented responsibilities in international research collaborations? And these equity-oriented responsibilities will differ from person to person based on, for example, their access to research resources, where they are located, the priorities of their communities, and all of that. But each person going into a collaboration should be able to ask themselves at the very beginning, what is my equity-oriented responsibility, both in terms of sharing of resources and in terms of defining research questions. But overall, everyone should be thinking, the questions we are asking and we seek to answer, is it answering questions of pertinence to populations in the global south? So I think that that is the advice I would give to early career researchers.
Thank you. So Sam, what would you like to add to this discussion?
In adding to what has been said, I would like to refer to everyone here to actually, for early career researchers to begin to look at existing research and existing document and resources that have been championed specifically by the three of my colleagues here. And I will just mention quickly and perhaps chronologically, starting with the oldest of those, is the Ottawa Statement on the Ethical Design and Conduct of Cluster Randomized Trial, which was had the lead author as Dr. Charles Beeger. And this has about 15 recommendations of how to conduct those cluster randomized trials ethically, and with 6 categories. And this includes justifying the trial design, research ethics committee review, informed consent, gatekeeping, benefit and harm, and protecting participants. And the second one has Dr. Doris Schroeder as lead author, and that's the Global Code of Conduct for Research in Resource-Poor Settings. And this has 23 articles that would be at the same time a framework, but also a kind of a guide. And these are enshrined under 4 principles of fairness, respect, care, and honesty. And the third one, on which Dr. Nchangwi has been a co-author of, is the Ethics and Governance Framework for Best Practices in Genomic Research and Biobanking in Africa. And to say the least, this has been a premier ethics framework for genomic research in Africa. And it provides principled and practical approaches to promote best practices, and has 3 components. One being to promote responsible conduct of research, including sharing decision and accountability. And guide also provides a guide to national regulations for genomic research. And finally, it also provides a framework that we can use to evaluate ethical soundness of genomic research. So these 3 documents can be real foundational foundation for starting to look towards equitable research.
Thank you. I think those give people a good idea of how to move beyond perhaps the more limited guidelines from their own institutions that might not cover, the kinds of complex issues we've been discussing here today. So, as some of the earlier examples showed, it's not only early career researchers who, confront these challenges. So, what can experienced researchers, perhaps experienced but not familiar with international research, what can they do to promote more equity in international research? And Doris is going to give us some thoughts about that.
Thank you very much, Janet. So I would like to make 2 points here. In my experience, the younger researchers who are highly mobile and who work internationally are often the ones who question practices that have been going on for decades. And I think the more senior researchers do very well if they listen to the younger researchers. So for instance, the New York Times published an article on paleontologists' approaches to international research, where some very shocking statements were published from the older researchers, things like, so you want me to appoint somebody locally? Do you want me to appoint somebody who is disabled and somebody who is colored at the same time? Some really shocking announcements were made there. And the younger researchers from the start said, if we go abroad, we want our local collaborators to be involved on an equitable basis because they have the funding, they make the decisions. And I believe the older researchers or more experienced ones should look to what the younger ones are doing. But the second point is also to raise awareness of what does patronizing conduct look like. Very often I get approached and people say, you've written about Kenya. I have always wanted to go to Kenya. Can't you make contacts with me? I want to go there during my PhD study, and I'm sure I can help this country. And the PhD supervisor doesn't have any contacts either. So explaining to people that this is already patronizing, that's, I think, what the more experienced researchers can do.
Okay, well, there's some good suggestions there. And what would you add, Charles?
So I guess what I would add is that of course partnership is at the core of this. So we need equitable partnerships between people in the global South and the global North. Making that really work requires the right people, sure, but it also requires institutional support and adequate infrastructure. So I think a number of entities here have a role to play. Funders, absolutely. So Cynthia's point about how the research agenda gets set, I thought was incredibly insightful. I mean, we're just not going to have equitable partnerships if it's funders in the global north who are determining what questions are going to be studied. And I really just wanted to emphasize her suggestion that funders do a better job of engaging stakeholders in the global south in order to set the research agenda. I think that's enormously important. Other institutions here have roles to play. I mean, hospitals, universities, non-governmental organizations have a number of key roles. I mean, obviously supporting the time for researchers, supporting time to develop novel relationships. I liked very much Sam's point that these relationships have to be true partnerships, not what we saw in the Ebola experience, right, where researchers from the global south were relegated to a subservient role, but rather a true partnership. And I think institutions, including employers, have a role to serve in making sure that is in fact the nature of the relationship. Cynthia as well made the point here that a good way to ensure that a relationship is equitable is to have defined responsibilities. I mean, that's how we know we have a relationship between equals, because the responsibilities are on a par. We need research ethics committees that are competent to review these studies, who know how to review a cluster randomized trial, and indeed who can even identify a cluster randomized trial when one is put in front of them. Governments too, of course, have a role, but I think we need to be so governments need to be partners in research, but we need to be very careful about handing off ethical concerns to government. Governments have all kinds of motivations, and not all of those are consonant with research of the highest ethical standards. So I think independent ethical review remains critical. And finally, we need international leadership with integrity from institutions, including the World Health Organization. Thanks.
Well, thanks to all of you. You've given us, so many different angles, to this issue. And now we're going to open it up for questions. And my colleague from Sage Publishing, Chris Bernage, has been monitoring the questions you've posted. So, Chris, why don't you share some of the questions that were posted by our attendees.
Would you like me to take on a question from the question box meanwhile?
Okay, I'm going to start with this first one, which I think is a common issue that student researchers face. What must I do in the case of completing my degree if there's no institutional ethics review board in the university? How can I address this as a student researcher?
Do you want me to have a go, Janet?
Sure.
So because this session is about global research, so traveling from a high income country to a lower income setting, personally, I think this is very difficult without ethics approval. So if there is no facility for ethics approval at home, then at least abroad it should be sought. So this in some way responds to two questions, because there is a question further down below which asks, why isn't an approval in every single country necessary? Because sometimes the institute in the Global South may accept the ethics approval from the North and reduce time and cost efforts. So if you are involved in two countries, it may be the best solution to accept an ethics approval from one country. So I'm hoping that this answers two of the questions at once.
Okay. One person, I think this gets us some of the comments that I think Cynthia was making about researchers, local researchers being engaged, but then not, having the credit given to them, the recognition given to them in publication. So, one of our questioners is asking about guidelines for getting research published in international journals, and how to work collaboratively if you're trying to do that. So, whoever on the panel wants to respond to this, what advice would you give to people who are looking to publish the research they've conducted internationally to make sure that they are recognizing the people who were instrumental in that?
So I think one approach that sometimes works is if the group of collaborators to have an authorship policy. And increasingly, collaborations are setting up authorship policies where they sort of define who is an author and who takes the first authorship or the senior authorship or what's the authorship order. And also, I'm not so sure, but I think there is the guidelines that states the criteria for, no, I think it's the ICMJE guidelines that has the criteria for who is an author. But I think the question of authorship also is very important for researchers in the Global South, because usually, since they have limited funding, and sometimes even with funding, they have a very limited proportion of the funding, they are unable to publish their studies in international journals. So it becomes restricted to local journals, and people don't get to read those studies because those journals do not have the visibility that many international journals have. And so these are some of the things that when we set up international research collaborations, we should be looking at. Are we setting aside resources for our Global South partners to publish their studies? Are we making sure that the early career researchers in the team are part of the authorships or are leading some of these papers? Are we ensuring that the Global South researchers also taking leadership in the writing of and publishing of these papers?
Anyone else have anything you want to add about the writing and publishing issues more broadly? Seems to me that would be a critical issue.
I can just jump in here, and I think this would be usually more of a concern for early career researchers when it comes to publishing of research. And often early career researchers, especially from the Global South, don't have a name. So it's this somebody coming out of the blues and perhaps sometimes even trying to champion an innovative research that then gets a kickback from journals or high-ranking publishers because there is no recognized name on the publication. And so that kind of pushes early career researchers to have to, in a way, try to collaborate with some already established researcher, but then in many cases, then that begins to become an issue, a kind of a power relation, where the early career researcher is only recognized insofar as there is a collaboration with some other recognized senior researcher, which most of the time would be more appealing if the senior researcher is from the Global North. If that practice were to be reverted to a situation where whoever has a has engaged in some original research can bring their research and be reviewed without looking at the face or the institution or the region from which the person is coming from, regardless of where the journal is hosted. Then that can help greatly for early career researchers.
Can I also add something, Janet?
Yes, yes, please.
I've just had an idea, and this is partly being an associate editor of Research Ethics. We get great papers from the Global South, but because it's not the main language, there is often a problem with English. And if they are then sent out and the reviewer comments come back, clarity, 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 you can't blame the reviewers either, because you need to understand what is the analysis, what are the points here. And somebody has asked, how can an early career researcher establish links in the Global South? So perhaps an innovative idea would be that the native speaking people who want to make contacts in the Global South offer through some mechanism an editing process for English, thereby establishing links with non-native speaking researchers, perhaps also early career researchers, and also doing something for bringing more papers from the Global South into established journals. Because I think it sounds mundane, but the English issue is a problem.
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought that up. There is an organization called Author Aid that does just what you've described. And I think when we post this recording, I will post a link to their site, because they offer really, opportunities, on both sides, for researchers who are in need of, that kind of assistance to present their work in the kind of form that is required to be published. And then also opportunities for people who have the experience in editing and reviewing, who are interested in mentoring others to bring those voices forward. So I think there's, that's a place where, a number of opportunities exist. So, if all of you have alluded to kind of, some of the kind of structural issues around funding and resources and other reasons why we, have this, great disparity, between people in different parts of the world, researchers trying to work in different parts of the world. So this one question is there something we can do to reduce this structural power imbalance in our research partnerships? Charles, maybe
a multi-million-dollar question. I'm not sure to answer it. So how do you make the world more equal is really the question, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, or how, I mean, there's always that sense, I mean, to me, it's like, well, you can't do everything, you can't make everything better, but maybe there is something you can do. So, whether it's on an individual level or, as a part of a research team, what are some ways that you can help to reduce this imbalance? What examples have you seen in the ways that you conduct your own research that would provide an example of that? Charles?
Yeah, I can give one example. So in 2017, I participated in something called the Global Forum for Bioethics in Research. And it's an annual meeting that brings together 50 researchers from the Global North and 50 researchers from the Global South who have an interest in bioethics, and it's people across career stages. It was amazing. It was an amazing experience for me, just to be in a room where there were so many people, so many smart young people from the Global South with so many ideas. It was inspiring to me as a researcher, and I got talking to one researcher in Malawi, Tiwo Matande, and she ended up coming to Canada for a month and doing a fellowship with me, and we wrote a paper together on research ethics in the international context that she was first author on in a different journal. I'm sorry to say, the Journal of Medical Ethics, and it was a wonderful experience for me as a senior person in the field. It was great to be able to have a mentoring relationship. It was valuable to me, and I think TWO valued it as well. So I think, you know, if we can have more events like this, more kind of networks in which it's possible to broker mentoring relationships, this might be one way of addressing the issue.
Anything anyone else would like to add to that? Doris?
Just to give a small example of something the more established researchers can do, what I've tried on several occasions, and I was successful with it on a few occasions, is PhD scholarships that were advertised by the university only for the UK and for Europeans to persuade the hierarchy that a bit more money could be added, and then it would be open to the overseas students. Mm-hmm. And that led to overseas students' applications and also getting the scholarship.
And so maybe one more addition to that.
Yes, go for it.
And I'll move a step further to Doris's contribution to add even postdocs. I know South African universities are very famous for attracting postdocs from across the globe. And they kind of have an emphasis for non-South African postdoctoral fellows to come into the South African institutions to come and do research, and in a way get mentorship from senior researchers within South Africa. And I think that's a very kind of a good approach to take. And if that goes beyond South Africa to, admittedly, South Africa being one of the leading universities in Africa, if we have other countries with high-ranking universities, having universities take this kind of approach where they focus on trying to get postdoctoral researchers who are not from the country, but also at least also give some kind of a good margin for researchers from the global south or from least developed countries, then that would create a very good room for collaboration. And in a few years, you would have more than just senior researchers and junior researchers, but you have a cohort of collaborators from across the board.
Thank you for that. So this, I think, is an intriguing question. Given that, you know, if you're doing international research and you have, you know, maybe multiple institutions involved, or multiple, say, an institution and government body that oversees research in that country, what advice can you give when there is a discrepancy between, you know, what these two different review boards or sets of guidelines, you know, are not in agreement?
Janet, can I make a technical point? Several people in the stream are saying that they always see charts, which is very nice, but they would like to see whoever is speaking. So the person who is speaking is not on the, so now you don't see me, you still see charts, you see.
Oh, okay.
Several people have now said that they wanted to see Sam and Cynthia when they spoke.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I've taken that off now.
Good. Now you need to repeat the question, I think.
Okay. What advice would you give when there are multiple review bodies, particularly in different countries or different, you know, institutions or governments in different countries that provide oversight, and their guidelines are not in agreement, or their response to a proposal are not in agreement?
Shall I?
Yes.
No, Cynthia first and then me.
Okay, thanks. I think it will be in a collaboration. When that happens, then you need to discuss, the partners or the collaborators will need to discuss how to go ahead. And I want to draw from our own project, the SICLE in Africa project, which has collaborators from different African countries. And that involves data sharing. And when we looked at the guidelines, for the ethics guidelines for the different countries, they had different requirements for assent, for parental consent, for data sharing, and it was very conflicting. So how do we harmonize that, especially because we have a central database? How do we ensure that the ethics requirements are consistent across sites? So we brought together the partners from the different countries and the leads of the ethics committees in those countries to say, see, this is the problem. What's the best way forward that still maintains that we keep the integrity in place, that we ensure that we are not going against the ethics is in place, even if legally that's not what is expected. Because I think that as we go forward with research, ethics guidelines need the change, they need to evolve, because things are changing, science is changing, and so people need to take into consideration some of these things. So sometimes as a collaboration, you need to discuss to see and find a middle ground for these contesting issues.
I also have a suggestion on a way forward on this topic. In my experience, what has worked in collaborations between Asian and European countries is that the two, let's say there are two ethics committees involved, or even several, that they at the beginning establish who does which approval first, so that especially the not so well resourced country doesn't have to draw up informed consent documentation, etc., but has some help from the better resourced country. And so that there is a collaboration from the start between the committees, which is also possibly highly positive for the resource poorer committee. And this has worked, I know from personal experience in the past.
I would also just point the questioner to the documents that were shared in the chat area that Charles introduced at the beginning of the session. And is there anything else that you want to add, Charles? Maybe have you encountered that where there's a disagreement between what one institution thinks is ethical and what is acceptable in another context?
Sure, I can say something about that. I mean, I think obviously what we'd like are sort of harmonized standards internationally. I mean, the basic principles that inform research ethics, I mean, I think are universal. So, in principle, harmonization among different countries' ethical requirements is possible. I think the part of the challenge is just that research ethics itself is moving, right? And so notions of waiver of consent, for instance, is an idea that's accepted in some international guidelines, some national guidelines, and yet not other national guidelines. And so that creates a real challenge when you're trying to do a study that where there's a plausible case for a waiver of consent. So where appropriate, I think we ought to be encouraging harmonization internationally. One space where we really see this is I think where we have innovative research methods. So cluster randomization is one example. There are a lot more cluster randomized trials being conducted today than 30 years ago. They're very pragmatic trials, and they're also sort of natural study designs when you're looking at, for instance, public health interventions. But the ethical issues in cluster randomized trials are relatively new, And we haven't really seen diffusion of ethical standards for cluster trials, internationally in the way that we'd like to. So, I mean, I predict this is going to be an ongoing issue because, science innovates and changes, and many of these new designs are going to raise new ethical issues that ultimately need to diffuse into national guidance.
Right. Okay, I have another question. I'm working with a colleague in Uzbekistan to replicate a study that used a survey to gain information about critical thinking perceptions of nursing educators in low and middle income countries. They have participants from colleagues in Turkey, Iraq, and Uzbekistan. They have expressed a desire to be listed as co-authors. To address this, we decided to expand the discussion section of the research to include them in writing the analysis and discussion of the results related to their country as a way to assure they have authorship. Is this appropriate? And I would just add, do you have other suggestions? This is kind of getting back to the questions around publishing the research once it's been conducted. Who would like to jump in on that one?
Shall I have a go? So what Kathleen wrote in the chat says they have expressed a desire to be listed as co-authors. Of course, that in itself is not sufficient. And I'm not sure we have sufficient information to say whether the co-authorship is warranted. The chance to offer co-authorship should come as early as possible. When all the data has been collected and everything has been done, at that point, if somebody expresses the desire to be listed as a co-author, it's very difficult for them to contribute to the paper. Then it's essentially too late. So what we put in the Global Code of Conduct for Research in Resource-Poor Settings under the honesty section is that at the outset of the research, all the roles should be distributed. And this is what Cynthia mentioned when she talked about a publication policy. So perhaps for next time. And Kathleen, feel free to send me a more detailed email for after the session.
Any other suggestions for questions of co-authorship?
If I can just add
Sure.
to Doris's, and I think this is not a specific response to the question, but perhaps just addressing more generally these kind of issues. I think the point is to begin the whole research process, as long as it's going to be, the research is happening in collaboration with other researchers, to perhaps presume that the outcome of the research or the research output would have everybody who is part of the research, unless if they otherwise choose not to be included. I think this would be a good mindset to approach the research with, so that researchers don't have to try to claim that I also want to be part of the publication. Some researchers may not be aware that this will be published in a journal at the beginning, but if these are all part of the conversation, and perhaps part of the presumption right from the get-go that if they're going to be publications from this research, those who collected the research and did the data analysis, that result of the product being published should automatically be part of the authors, and unless if they choose not to be included.
Okay, I want to just pose one more question. I think this will be our last one we'll have time for. I think is an interesting one, and kind of gets a little bit to what Charles was just talking about in terms of, as methods for doing research change, with the new dilemmas that come up. And this questioner asks, if someone can recommend an ethics paradigm for situations in which research doesn't rise to the level of being reviewed by review boards because, for example, it's using compiled public data, or other kinds of social media posts, or things that in some cases would be considered say big data or compilations of data that, you know, whether it's deemed that the study doesn't include human participants per se, so it's not subject to review. What suggestions do you have in those situations?
We have some fantastic papers in the journal on this type of research. So perhaps this is one that I could answer afterwards with
okay.
the links.
Okay, it's great. Well, I think we're coming to the close of our hour, and I just want to thank all of the panelists and to our attendees, on whether you're here with us today or watching this recording. We hope that, you know, this has given you some suggestions. You know, as I said earlier, no one of us by ourselves can solve these problems, but, you know, we can take whatever actions, you know, are, you know, within our realm to try to take some steps forward. And I think, you know, this panel has given us a lot of terrific ideas, and we will also share the resources that you've suggested in the follow-up post on methodspace.com. So we hope you'll visit MethodSpace and find resources that will help you, because it is open access. And we're also always interested in featuring guest posts by people who have a variety of perspectives and experience with conducting, analyzing, and disseminating research. So, you know, consider this as an invitation to contact me if you have something that you'd like to contribute. So any parting comments from the panel?
Can I just thank you for making this happen, for choosing research ethics for one of just 4 slots in your webinars, Janet. Thank you.
All righty. Okay, well, thanks everyone. And we'll look forward to interacting with you more informally online, and sharing additional resources that we hope will be useful in your work.
And thanks to all the attendees. Fabulous questions.
Yes.